told CK on the radio. We're ready to show people that after all, there was nothing to be afraid of, and we're really very ordinary people. In fact, when they come down Saturday night, they'll have a hard time deciding who are nudists and who aren't, because of course we'll be wearing clothes too. So I want to use these leading Canadian promoters, Ray and Mildred Connett, to introduce the history of nudism in Canada in the 1940s and 50s. And I'm also going to highlight their use of two media, the radio interviews that they and other nudists gave with journalists, as well as a magazine, a Canadian magazine called Sunbathing for Health, both of which the Connetts used to introduce and promote the nudist movement to Canadians. And in reflecting on these different media, I'm going to speak to some of the challenges I encountered locating nudists in the archives and how these two media provided me a way through this. And then finally, I want to explore a key message that Connetts repeated time and again in their promotional efforts, that while nudism might be a unique social practice that offered benefits to physical and mental health and family life, nudists were also, quote, really very ordinary people. So in embarking on this research project, I was initially drawn to the topic of nudism for two main reasons. First, because I saw it as a means of exploring historical attitudes towards the body. How have the ways people thought about and experienced their bodies changed over time? It seemed to me that studying the history of nudism in Canada might provide insight on these questions and related topics such as gender, sexuality, child rearing, nude photography, and the relation between humans and the natural world. And the second reason I was drawn to this topic was because I recognized that the Canadian nudist movement did not exist in a vacuum. Despite its status as a marginal social movement that never entered the mainstream of Canadian culture, the study of nudism provides a revealing look at how a subset of Canadians positioned themselves in relation to social norms and how they navigated the social and cultural changes of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I'm going to provide a really high-level overview of the emergence of the nudist movement. Nudism emerged as part of a far-reaching social phenomenon sweeping Germany at the turn of the 20th century, known as the Lebensreform or life reform movement. Other manifestations of German Lebensreform included vegetarianism, hiking, and conservation movements. But common to all of these was the shared objective to reorient the German people toward nature and thereby to find solutions to the problems of modern urban industrial society. By nature, as historian John Williams explains, nudists meant both the non-human rural environment and the naked human body. And this turn to nature was supposed to address the effects of pollution, overcrowding, and poor working conditions on the health of the German people, problems that were believed to have physical, mental, and moral consequences. Pioneers of German nudism believed that performing activities in the nude would allow people to take full advantage of sunshine and fresh air, and would also promote greater care for the body. And at the core of their philosophy, nudists believed nudity was a natural state of being, that social nudism offered a path to physical, mental, and moral health, and that individual renewal would lead to national regeneration. During the interwar period, nudism spread through Western Europe, as well as to Britain, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Canada's oldest nudist club, the Van Tan Club, opened in North Vancouver in 1939, but organized nudism really only became firmly established in Canada after the Second World War. And this was particularly driven by the high levels of European immigration that came at the conclusion of the Second World War, with these immigrants providing an influx of leaders and members to the fledgling Canadian movement. Despite the implication of the common misnomer nudist colony, nudist clubs were not permanent residential communities, but weekend and summer recreational sites that really served as alternatives to modern public beaches, parks, and campgrounds. The development of Canadian nudism coincided with the post-war public recreation movement, the proliferation of national and provincial parks, and the golden age of the family vacation, as some historians have referred to it, all of which were facilitated by increased leisure time, disposable income, and car ownership enjoyed by post-war Canadians, as well as ongoing urbanization. So as more and more Canadians are living in cities, they're also looking for ways to escape the cities in their free time. Within this context, nudist clubs emerged on the outskirts of many Canadian urban centers, but were most numerous in the Greater Vancouver area and southwestern Ontario. So those were really the two centers of the nudist movement. They were the areas of greatest population density and also the areas that received the highest number of post-war immigrants as well. By 1960, there were more than 20 nudist clubs operating in Canada, with memberships ranging in size from 10 to more than 400 members. And so I want to provide a little bit more background on the Connetts as well. Ray Connett had first made contact with the nudist movement when he picked up a copy of the American magazine, The Nudist, on a cross-border trip to Bellingham, Washington, from his Vancouver home during the 1930s. He also became a reader of the English nudist magazine, Health and Efficiency. And so these international magazines were circulating and helping people encounter the movement in places where there wasn't really an actual movement yet. So through reading these American and British nudist magazines, it enabled him to detect the reference in a discreetly worded personals ad placed in the Vancouver province in 1939 that read, quote, "Member of NSAA wishes to form similar club here." And so the ad alluded to the British nudist organization, the National Sun Air Association. And this sort of coded language was a means of overcoming the refusal of many publications to openly advertise nudist activities or organizations, as well as a means to protect the privacy of the people putting these ads into the paper. According to the couple's accounts later on, Ray convinced Mildred to give nudism a try, and the two subsequently became founding members of the Vantown Club in 1939, which is Canada's oldest continuously operating nudist club. The Second World War soon interrupted the club's development by limiting members' resources and leisure time, as well as by the fact that some of the men and women too presumably left to serve overseas. At the same time, that gave some Canadian soldiers the opportunity, like Ray Connett, to visit British nudist clubs during the war and to gain a different kind of experience with the nudist movement. So after the war, the Connetts resumed their nudist club involvement, playing integral volunteer roles within their clubs, as well as within an emerging national nudist movement. Ray Connett was present at the creation of a national nudist organization, the Canadian Sunbathing Association, in Vancouver in the fall of 1947. Those present at this gathering composed a constitution and elected an executive, and Connett was elected national secretary, a role he held for close to a decade. And during this period, his advice was frequently sought by national and local nudist leaders, and sometimes offered unsolicited. He carried on a very active correspondence with nudists across Canada and beyond, and which were really interesting sources for me to access those letters that I was able to find copies of. In the 1940s, which is where we pick up our story, Ray and Mildred Connett were married with one teenage daughter and living in the Greater Vancouver area. Ray worked as a sorting clerk for Canada Post, and Mildred worked part-time in retail. But they spent much of their free time practicing social nudism and working to promote it. And in the early 1950s, as I mentioned earlier, they left the Vantown Club to help found the Sunny Trails Club in Surrey, BC. In some ways, the Connetts were unique within the nudist movement. Many of the post-war leaders and members of the movement in Canada were Europeans who had immigrated after the war, Germans being most numerous among them. The Connetts, however, were Canadian-born. The Connetts were also more willing than most to campaign publicly for the movement at a time when others were sometimes hesitant to go on the record publicly about how they passed their leisure time. And in fact, it was a policy at most Canadian clubs in the 50s and 60s to use first names only as a means of protecting members' privacy, as well as to avoid discussion of people's places of employment because of fear of exposure. In other ways, the Connetts were more representative of Canadian nudists. Many Canadian nudist clubs were led by husband and wife teams, like the Connetts, and their working class status was also not unusual. In the post-war period, Canadian nudism drew significant working class membership. An early Canadian Sunbathing Association president, Marcus Mead, owned a machine shop, and Lakesun owner Hans Behrman worked in a Kingston department store. Hans Stein, who started the Ponderosa Nature Resort in the Hamilton area with his wife, sister, and brother-in-law in 1965, 8 years after immigrating from Germany, noted, "3 of us, we all worked night shifts in Hamilton, in the steel company, United Gas, Otis Elevator, and so on. We all did night shifts while building their club from the ground up by day." So while club fees and the near necessity of car ownership to travel to a club were real financial barriers to nudist club membership, in the early years of Canadian nudist organization, affordability of membership was a priority of many clubs, and clubs were also often cooperative. Members contributed their labor to facilitate the construction of recreational facilities, digging pools or artificial lakes, creating volleyball courts, erecting fences or barriers to ensure that their private property was protected from view. And so that allowed them to offer recreational facilities at a fairly low price. Over time, many clubs began charging higher fees in exchange for providing and maintaining facilities such as pools, clubhouses, and lodging. But rising wages over the course of the post-war period and improved standard of living meant that nudist club membership likely remained financially accessible to a large percentage of Canadians, comparable to the cost of spending summer holidays camping or road tripping. In the 1950s, Mildred Connett wrote favorably of the affordability of nudism, promoting nudist clubs as, quote, "so much cheaper than going to expensive resorts where the kids want hot dogs or chips or ice cream every time you turn around." So I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of finding nudists in the archives. When I began my research on the history of nudism in Canada, I began where most historians begin, with the question of where to find primary sources. And I quickly found that most Canadian public archives had fairly limited records on nudism. I turned to contemporary nudist organizations and archives, both in Canada and the United States, where I was fortunate to gain access to records such as private correspondence between nudist leaders, as well as club records such as newsletters and membership applications. There were, however, 2 types of primary source material that I was able to locate in a range of public archives and libraries across Canada that proved to be a rich source of information to me. The first was a Canadian magazine called Sunbathing for Health that was published between 1947 and 1959, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the second was media coverage of the nudist movement, particularly radio reporting, which for obvious reasons lent itself better to covering nudism than television did. That said, I couldn't resist including a little clip of a television interview that June Callwood, well-known Canadian journalist June Callwood, conducted and which aired on CBC television in 1961, where she interviewed a Niagara area couple that operated a nudist club in that region. So although the nudist movement never managed to recruit a significant percentage of Canadians to join its ranks, it did receive considerable press coverage. And the Connetts were actively engaged with both of these types of media, the magazine and the engagement with journalists, as we're going to see. In fact, some of the radio coverage I was able to access was radio coverage about the Connett Sunny Trails Club that had been recorded from the radio by Ray Connett and subsequently donated to the BC Archives. I also spent time at the radio archives of the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, where I accessed additional coverage from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 24 different radio interviews in total. And it was an incredible experience to hear voices from the past, including the voices of people like Ray Connett, who I had come to know first through textual sources. And so these sources need to be seen for what they are, which were largely efforts to market the movement and cast it in the best possible light. But they are valuable for the insight they offer into that very topic in terms of how nudists presented their movement to the public. And in the post-war culture of public paranoia about communist espionage and closeted homosexuality, nudists increasingly opted to expose themselves to public view, rejecting strategies of concealment and secrecy that had been common features of North American nudism in the 30s and 40s. And as I've noted, in the past, nudists had often resorted to placing discreetly worded advertisements in local newspapers and using only first names to protect their identities. But during the 50s, this began to change, and the Connetts played a leading role in promoting an attitude of openness and transparency to public scrutiny. Ray Connett wrote in Sunbathing for Health magazine, "If we nudists wish to become an accepted part of the Canadian scene, if we hope to recruit more members, and above all, if we want the privilege of practicing nudism in our private clubs without fear of molestation by busybodies or snoopers, we must cease to be strange. There is only one way to do that. We must put ourselves in the public eye until the public eyebrow no longer raises in astonishment or shocked disapproval when they hear of us." So Sunbathing for Health magazine was a monthly periodical published in Toronto between 1947 and 1959. And this became probably the most important means of growing and publicizing the Canadian nudist movement in the 1950s. Regular features included nature and cooking columns, health and beauty series, reports on American and European clubs, testimonials from converts to nudism, and fictionalized accounts of first experiences with nudism. Each issue of Sunbathing for Health ran about 35 pages in length, and approximately a third of the magazine was devoted to full-page nude photos, with additional snapshots interspersed with the text. Depending on local censorship and the decisions of individual vendors, the magazine could be difficult to acquire on newsstands in some parts of Canada, particularly Quebec and Toronto, but subscriptions could be obtained by mail. And as well as being distributed across Canada, Sunbathing for Health was widely sold in the United States. The magazine was published by the Rex Book Company, a division of the Sinnott News Company based in Scarborough, Ontario. And while seemingly sympathetic to the aims of the nudist movement, the publisher was motivated to publish the magazine for commercial rather than ideological reasons. The cost of the magazine ranged from 35 cents per issue in 1947 to 50 cents in 1959. And Sinnott News was primarily a distribution company with a mail order service that featured in the back of the magazine, which was likely as profitable as the magazine itself. Readers could order a wide range of literature through the publisher, including erotic fiction, advice books on health and sexuality, collections of nude photography, and nudist promotional material. Nudist readers, or those who declared themselves sympathetic to the philosophy, sometimes complained that the magazine was sold alongside, quote, low-grade, girly, and expose type of publications, and expressed displeasure with the mail order ads contained in the magazine. Nevertheless, the magazine earned credibility by publishing articles and columns by bona fide nudists, including Canadian, American, British, and Australian, and particularly through Ray and Mildred Connett's active involvement with the publication. In 1946, Ray Connett, back from overseas service, approached Sinnott about the possibility of contributing an original column. And his column, entitled Sunny Trails, A Nudist Call to Canada, began shortly thereafter and appeared in every subsequent issue. The magazine also featured Connett's wife, Mildred Harris, writing under her maiden name, and I may sometimes refer to her as Harris going forward for clarity's sake. And she contributed a column called The Woman's Page. Harris's column was primarily addressed to the hesitant wives of male readers, offering advice to their husbands and encouragement to the women. Playing on gendered stereotypes, she explained her, quote, big interest in life was to persuade others, especially you scared, a bit standoffish, or just plain bashful girls, to come to camp and try our life just once. Together, the Connetts reported on the state of nudism in Canada, offered advice on the practice of nudism and club organization, and responded to readers' questions, some of which were published on the readers' page. The magazine provided a forum for individual nudists and small isolated nudist groups from across Canada to exchange news and ideas, to organize, and to promote their philosophy to a wider public audience. During the interwar period, there had been rumored nudist activity in spots ranging from Vancouver Island to Edmonton to Toronto, though little evidence of these remains. In his first column in Sunbathing for Health, Connett put out a cross-Canada query, is there a nudist in the house? At the time, the country had only two formally organized clubs, the Van Tans and a group in Ontario known as the Sun Air Freedom Lovers. But individual nudists and would-be nudists and small informal sunbathing groups of 3 or 4 also responded to Connett. And he began forwarding letters the magazine received from prospective nudists to club organizers in their area, and eventually club listings and contact information were published in the magazine. Over the years, a variety of club leaders from across Canada contributed reports and articles on nudism, but Connett was the dominant voice of the movement in Sunbathing for Health magazine. When the publication ceased in 1959, he declared, what there is of the Canadian nudist movement probably owes its existence to this magazine. And while perhaps something of an overstatement, Sunbathing for Health certainly played an important role in the growth of Canadian nudism in the post-war years. So I want to look more at some of the messages that the Connetts conveyed as they engaged with journalists and as they wrote their columns and contributed their columns to Sunbathing for Health. And one of the really big messages that they forwarded was this emphasis on nudists as normal and ordinary Canadians. As a movement seeking to broaden its appeal, as well as forward a critique of cultural attitudes towards nudity in the West, nudists have always been engaged in a complex negotiation of social norms. Even as they transgressed the social taboo against nudity, nudists sought social respectability. In a 1952 Sunbathing for Health column, Ray Connett explained, it goes without saying that to inspire others to try a way of life which is still unacceptable to normal society, one must in every other way but this be completely normal, above reproach in all things. So nudists were sensitive, not just Connett, but other nudists as well, were sensitive to the countercultural aspects of their movement and took great pains to stress that they were not socially deviant. Nudists believed if they could cease to be strange in the public imagination, they would make great progress towards widespread acceptance. Connett's advice to Canadian nudists was to, quote, be ordinary. People resent outsiders because they are different. The pioneers of Canadian nudism were concerned with growing the movement and with fashioning a public image of nudism. The two were linked, as clubs were concerned to attract members who would reflect well on the movement as a whole. Throughout the 50s and 60s, winning social respectability seemed to be the overriding concern of Canada's nudist clubs and at the center of club policies and practices. Through club operations, particularly admission and behavioral standards, nudists articulated self-perceptions of who or what they were, but just as importantly, of who or what they were not. And this concern with normalcy and respectability was reflected in club membership screening. Ray Connett explained, as in every fraternal movement, there is the magic spark of hospitality and friendship wherever you go, once you're in. But because we have such a radical new idea, this clothesless life, we must be so very careful who gets in. And recognizing this, this concern and this reality, Connett counseled Sunbathing for Health readers on how to prepare for the interview that they would go through before joining a club, and alerting them to what factors might influence the decision of their club representatives. He wrote, "Naturally, you will give careful attention to your appearance, cleanliness, and tidiness in your clothes. There's no need to be a fashion plate. In fact, this could prejudice one against you. But your clothes must be neat and clean, you must be shaven, and your body must give an appearance of cleanliness and betray no odor which would reveal you as careless of body cleanliness. If you are a married couple or a family, you are almost sure to be accepted in most clubs, unless your surroundings are impossible. If you have children, it is to be hoped that their manners will stand you in good stead. That is a matter of training and will reveal much about you." So before stripping away the barrier of clothing, nudists erected a new barrier, the screening process itself. And the privilege of participating in a nudist club was premised on the successful navigation of this hurdle. The marginal social status of the nudist movement lent a great deal of import to the screening of membership applicants. Interviewers considered whether they believed a prospective member would reflect positively on nudism and their fellow nudists. The Connetts acknowledged that this could lead to problems. Ray Connett noted in the magazine that more often than not, the quote, odd character would not be admitted to a club. And Mildred Harris acknowledged a problem of clickiness among founding nudist club members, which could lead them to decide they, quote, prefer not to take in strangers, especially Black, brown, yellow, or single ones, which alludes to some of the other kinds of social norms that were coming into play in their screening process. Many Canadian clubs, as Connett explained, were run on the principle of majority rules, which was not without its problems, as he acknowledged. But as far as Connett and most Canadian club leaders were concerned, it was better to err on the side of exclusion than risk scandal. Once admitted to a club, the practice of nudism also occurred within a highly regulated environment. Connett declared, "It's total freedom we want, but this does not mean permissiveness." And he described nudist clubs as having, quote, a Sunday school picnic morality. Clubs demanded that people regulate themselves even more carefully than they would in a clothed public context. So while nudists shed their clothing, they substituted other forms of containment, other boundaries, the club screening process, strict standards of behavior, as well as the physical boundaries of the club property itself. And nudists were very careful to be respectful of the Canadian Criminal Code, which made it a criminal offense to be nude in a public place or in a place visible to the public. And so they very carefully confined their activities to shielded private properties. And this photograph is from the Sunny Trails Club in Surrey in the 50s. And so you can see there's sort of artificial lake in the middle and a variety of people kind of lounging around on a summer day. Another way in which nudists were concerned to be ordinary was in their embrace of heterosexual norms. And reflecting post-war society's romance with the nuclear family, nudists cast their practice as strengthening, not undermining, marriage and family life. And they made it clear that sexual activity had no place in the nudist club. In fact, in the post-war context, a quote, well-adjusted sexual identity and marital happiness were promoted as key benefits nudism offered, as the movement shifted focus from the physical health benefits that had often been extolled by early nudists. And so what happens is that although nudism has always kind of paired an emphasis on both physical and mental health, I would say that in the earlier, like first half of the 20th century, there is more of an emphasis on physical health. Whereas in the 1950s onward, there's that shift to a focus on psychological health and sexual adjustment. As you know, antibiotics and vaccines are really helping improve people's lifespans. There's this kind of growing concern about people's psychological health, and nudism is tapping into that and reflecting those concerns. Nudists denied a causal relationship between nudity and sexuality. Ray explained, nudity does not create sex feeling, at least not in the natural state which is practiced in well-operated clubs. The average person is sure that the act of removing all of one's clothing is automatically a prelude to sex activity. This simply is not so. Nudists argued that any connection between the two depended on the context in which nudity occurred and the attitude with which it was approached. And Ray elaborated, if you make up your mind to take off your clothes for the sake of health, greater freedom of movement in the water, more enjoyment of the sun, or any of the countless number of healthful, sincere, and decent reasons, then you experience no sex thrill. But if you take off your clothes to incite sex, then you may perhaps not be disappointed. In fact, nudists suggested clothing, not nudity, heightened sexual desire by cloaking the body in mystery, and suggested nudity was less sexually stimulating than, for example, a tight clinging bathing suit. In her Woman's Page column, Mildred Connett wrote, I found after several years of naturism that men don't look near as much in a nature camp as they do where clothes give a hint of something mysterious and secret, something hidden. And nudists sometimes also talked about the idea that they pushed back against the idea that what they were doing was exposing themselves, and kind of flipped the script and said that actually what everybody else was doing was covering themselves up. So free from the, quote, artificial stimulation of clothing, sex could assume its proper place in the nudist life, which Ray and Mildred Connett defined as, quote, a relatively infrequent activity confined to the privacy of the home and the marriage bed. And they fervently articulated this perspective in their respective Sunbathing for Health columns, each drawing on their own experiences to explain the effects of nudism on the marital relationship and elucidate the relationship between nudism and sexuality. Responding to a female reader who had expressed concern about, quote, sex problems at nudist camps, Harris offered the ultimate reassurance to a hesitant wife. She claimed that her own enjoyment of her sexual relationship with her husband had increased as a result of their nudist lifestyle. Furthermore, Mildred declared, from talking to other wives, I think too that it can be said with confidence that the nudist club is the best place in the world to reclaim an erring husband. And she proposed nudism as an antidote to, quote, a shaky domestic situation, suggesting couples who are no longer happy together, seeking freedom elsewhere, can find happiness together in our clubs if they will but try our life. And Ray Connett similarly affirmed the positive impact of nudism on their own marriage, contrasting his frame of mind before becoming a nudist with his attitude since. He wrote, after the first nudist outing, and increasingly after subsequent outings, I felt somehow that my wife was better than any other woman in the world. She appeared to me on a pedestal. I wanted no other. And I will be honest now, for with the years come honesty, and admit that such had not always been the case. Nudism put all that behind me. Nudist husbands and nudist wives enjoy the companionship and pleasures of married life as thoroughly and completely, but with considerable more frankness and decency than do non-nudists. I know, for I have been both. And I have read letters from non-nudists, I get them still, which reveal the shocking attitude of so many towards that which should be so fine and beautiful, that is the sex side of life. So from the Connett's perspective, far from encouraging superficial or short-term sexual relationships, nudism promoted authentic and honest relationships based on a true knowledge of one another. It enhanced intimacy between husbands and wives by freeing them of pretense and enabling them to know and respect one another in a deeper way. The Connetts held a romantic view of marriage and stressed that nudism would enhance the sexual fulfillment and emotional intimacy that they believed was fundamental to the marital relationship. So the establishment of the nudist movement in Canada on a firm footing in the 1950s and 1960s preceded the sexual revolution. But despite the buttoned-up stereotype of the 1950s that persists so often in our cultural imaginary, important changes in sexual behavior had already occurred over the first half of the 20th century. Based on cultural analyses, birth rates, and sexual surveys, such as those conducted by Alfred Kinsey and his researchers in the United States in the 1940s, a number of historians have pointed to the 1910s and 1920s as an important turning point in the history of sexuality in Canada and the United States. Education rates for women increased, white women won the right to vote in political elections, and men and women mingled as never before at work and in leisure time. Birth rates, which had begun to drop in the last quarter of the 19th century, continued to decline through the end of the Second World War. Men and women increasingly disentangled older associations between sex and procreation, and Protestant churches began to drop their theological opposition to contraception. As dating replaced courting and moved from front porch to back seat, in the words of American historian Beth Bailey, couples had more freedom and privacy to engage in premarital sexual activity, from quote, necking and petting to intercourse. This period also saw a reduction in the sexual double standard, with a growing expectation that male sexuality, as well as female sexuality, be confined to a monogamous heterosexual relationship. According to the Kinsey reports, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, published in 1948 and 1953, respectively, women born between 1900 and 1920 were twice as likely to report engaging in premarital sexual intercourse as women born before 1900, 36%, up from 14%. While men born after 1900 were far less likely to report having engaged in sex with prostitutes compared to previous generations. Despite these changes, technical virginity and the association of women's value with their sexual virtue remained significant and was accommodated by a drop in the average age of first marriages following the Second World War, which provided a means for teenagers and young adults to have socially sanctioned sex. At the same time, expectations rose that marriage would provide not only economic and social stability, but individual, emotional, and sexual fulfillment. Rebecca Davis argues that, quote, the definition of a successful marriage had transformed from an early 20th century ability to avoid divorce failure to a late 20th century model of mutual emotional, financial, and sexual gratification. So Ray and Mildred Connett, as you've kind of gotten snippets of in these excerpts from their writings, espoused a view of sexuality consistent with what historians John D'Amelio and Estelle B. Friedman describe as the sexual ethic dominant by the mid-20th century, which consisted of the affirmation of sexual pleasure in its own right, apart from reproduction, and sharp differentiation of normal, quote unquote, normal heterosexuality from sexuality perceived as threatening or deviant. In post-war Canada, psychologists, church leaders, and sex educators affirmed heterosexual marriage as the fundamental adult relationship and as the place in which sexuality would and should find ultimate expression. The Connetts reflected these values, and they believed that nudism, far from undermining the institution of marriage, reinforced its foundation. Connett declared, marriage is as natural and proper to nudists as it is among clothed people. Why not? Nudists are completely normal in every respect. They observe the same laws and in most respects have the same feelings as the more conventional folk. But while heterosexual marriage remained the socially acceptable avenue for sexual activity in the 1950s, changes were percolating. American historian Alan Pattini points to, quote, exploding levels of premarital sex during the 40s and 50s based on an analysis of premarital and out-of-wedlock pregnancy rates in the United States. He rejects the assertion of scholars such as Elaine Tyler May, John D'Amelio, and Estelle Freeman that levels of premarital sexual intercourse remained constant from the 1920s to the 1960s, arguing that a lack of cultural candidness masked real increases in premarital sexual activity in the immediate post-war years. And in Canada, illegitimate teen pregnancy rates rose between 1945 and 1961, and gay and lesbian subcultures also grew in size and visibility. And so, you know, it can be difficult to get access to the behavior of couples behind closed doors or in cars in this period, but through looking at a variety of different factors, there's a bit of a debate going on here. Tellingly, the perspective Ray Connett shared in private did not entirely align with the public messages he and Harris espoused. In a letter to a Toronto area organizer in the late 1940s, Ray Connett wrote, "Regarding your personal observations, re members of your club, I am inclined to think that, like many new nudists who have not been tempered by several years of nudism and visits to several camps, you may be a little narrow or overcritical in what you expect of fellow nudists. Your member who sees nothing wrong in sexual intercourse between single people is surely with the majority in this modern age. I don't think you could find many club members anywhere, Reg, who would disagree with him or think him an undesirable, so long as such activities were kept entirely outside the club." So nudists tread a careful line where sexuality was concerned. They sought to convey that they were not swingers or sexual deviants on the one hand, nor asexual or prudish on the other, and that social nudism could go hand in hand with a, quote, normal sex life. Navigating this territory could be tricky, however, in a context where sexual norms were shifting. As Canada entered a period of dramatic social and cultural changes, beginning in the second half of the 1960s and continuing through the 1970s, the nudist movement in Canada experienced something of an identity crisis. As a result of their campaign to attract Canadians and achieve social acceptance by affirming sexual and gender norms and enforcing strict standards of behavior on club grounds, nudism risked being perceived as behind the times. In response to the, quote, swinging 60s, clubs began to reevaluate their messaging and policies. In particular, nudist clubs grappled with how to respond to more widespread social drinking. Alcohol had been banned. Consumption of alcohol in club grounds had been banned in the early decades of Canadian nudism. They also grappled with how to respond to the sexual revolution, second wave feminism, and the modern environmental movement. Many clubs relaxed restrictions on alcohol consumption and bans on separated or divorced individuals. Some launched provocative pageants that attracted publicity and helped fund extensive property development, emphasizing greater openness to sexuality while objectifying women's bodies for financial gain. Other nudists found their purpose through re-emphasizing the connection between nudity and the natural world, vaguely aligning themselves with the environmental movement. So nudism resists sort of simple liberal or conservative labels, and clubs adopted a range of responses to the social and cultural changes throughout the 60s and 70s. And if you're interested in any of those topics, you can find out more about those in my book. So in closing, there's the question of how people reacted. How did visitors react to the messages the Connetts and others like them were promoting? How was the Connetts' message received? The reactions of journalists who visited Canada's nudist clubs and interviewed nudists like Ray Connett offer insight into this question. Les White, the CKNW reporter who interviewed Connett at the Sunny Trails Club's open house in 1953, returned the following year when the club hosted the 8th annual convention of the Canadian Sunbathing Association. At the conclusion of his report, White reflected, "You meet some of the nicest people in the most unusual places. That about sums up an afternoon's visit in the Sunny Trails Club. All members are above reproach morally and are members for the sole reason of loving the sun, possibly more than most. You might approach the club for a visit with a certain amount of doubt, but you're certain to leave with a feeling of wonder." White also invited reaction from members of the public who had attended, the select members who had been invited to attend the day after the open house and see nudists participating in their activities in the nude. And so those included city councillors and members of the local parent-teacher association. A woman named Mrs. Jones was a little less enthusiastic than White in her response, observing, quote, "Well, the camp itself, I guess, is okay, but I don't think I would ever want to join it." Journalist Jean Howarth reported even more critically on her impressions after visiting the Sunny Trails Club in 1955 in a feature article she wrote and contributed to Liberty magazine. She drew the ire of Sunny Trail Club members for her observations, which included, apart from having nothing on, they were entirely conventional. They might have escaped from body covering, but their souls still wore corsets. And so I think these differing reactions kind of speak to the fact that nudists were engaged in a balancing act, offering people the chance to take part in a unique social practice while simultaneously asserting their normalcy and respectability. Ironically, sociologist Joanne Entwistle argues that fashion exhibits the same tension, expressing, quote, the contradictory desires to fit in and stand out. In 1958, Ray and Mildred gave up their jobs and undertook an extended trip across North America before settling in Northern California. There they founded the Glen Eden Sun Club in 1963 and lived out their lives on the club property, dying in the late 1990s. They left a lasting impact, however, on the Canadian nudist movement, locally through their extensive involvement in the Van Tan and Sunny Trails clubs, and on a wider scale through their contributions to Sunbathing for Health magazine and through their engagement with the Canadian press. In doing so, they went to great lengths to help nudists, quote, cease to be strange to the Canadian public. So I'll leave it there. There's a link to my book if you're interested in finding out more about any of the topics I've touched on today. And I would, be happy to open that up. And I think we have some time for questions and discussion. I'd be interested in hearing from you too about anything that stood out for you or struck you or that you'd like to talk more about. Thank you.